Hello, hola, como está? My name's Roger Watson, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice, which is published by Elsevier. And in this session, I'm going to be talking to you about advancing the quality of an academic nursing journal. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation, and I look forward afterwards to having a discussion with you and trying to answer any questions which you may have. Once again, thank you. Obrigado. I'm going to approach the contents of this session by looking first of all at the responsibilities of an editor-in-chief. Of course, an editor-in-chief may well be called an editor. The terminology changes across publishers and across different journals. But what I mean here are the responsibilities of the editor in charge of the journal. I'm also going to look at the end at open science, which is an increasingly important aspect of academic publishing. Under the responsibilities of an editor-in-chief, I'm going to look at copy flow and at quality of articles and at promoting the journal, primarily using social media. So the responsibilities of an editor-in-chief are threefold. As I've said already, copy flow. One of the most important things that you can do for your publisher and as a good service to your authors and to the editors that are working with you is to ensure a good system of copy flow through the journal. One whereby everyone knows what their responsibilities are and where the manuscripts are and what stage they are at, and also one, and this is primarily the responsibility of the editor-in-chief, one which gets manuscripts quickly from the process of submission through either to rejection, revision, or to final acceptance. So I'm going to look first of all at copy flow. Then I'm going to look at the quality of the articles and the kind of things that you, as an editor-in-chief, along with your publisher, can do to ensure that articles are published and that they're published of the highest possible quality. And then finally, under this section, I'm going to look at ways of promoting your journal. Well, first of all, and many of you who are working as editors will already know this, there are a great many challenges with copy flow, and the more articles that are submitted to academic journals, and many more are submitted these days than they were when I was initially working in academic publishing, the more articles that are submitted, the greater the issues are with copy flow. There are various points at which this can become very slow and even blocked if you're not very careful. So you need to be able to keep your eye on the copy flow and to make sure that manuscripts are processed as quickly and efficiently and of course as fairly as possible. So the initial challenge is really the pressure on the system, the increasing number of submissions, not only from every country, but from some specific countries. For example, in my region of the world, one of the major areas from which we receive submissions is the Far East and China, and these are outweighing all of our other submissions. These submissions are very welcome, but of course they put more pressure on our system. We also have considerable problems finding peer reviewers, and I think that all editors recognize this as a major problem. Finding peer reviewers not only who are willing to review articles, but ones with the right expertise, and also ones who, having agreed to review a manuscript, will get it back to you within reasonable time, and also will make helpful comments for you, for your editors, and for the authors. The ability to manage copy flow is clearly one of the most important tasks of the editor-in-chief, and I'm going to look at this under 4 headings. The first heading is quite simple and possibly doesn't even need to be said. It's common sense that you need to check into your submission system regularly. I would say at least daily on working days, perhaps 5 days a week. I really don't think it works if you leave your journal work until the weekend or dedicate 1 day a week to it. Things can quickly become overwhelming, and it's much easier to check in, check the submissions, decide very quickly which ones may go forward, which ones may need to be rejected, and possibly even to keep up with accepting and final editing of papers that have come through from your editors and reviewers as worthy of being accepted. But I would certainly focus on the submissions and making sure that they are moved on as quickly as possible. I think that you should have the facility, or at least the ability, in agreement with your publishers, to desk reject manuscripts. In other words, if you can see very quickly that a manuscript does not meet the aims of the journal or does not fit the journal, so for example, my journal is an educational journal. If I have a manuscript that's purely about a clinical study, that will be rejected immediately as not fitting the journal. Others will be rejected on the basis of not meeting the appropriate standards. For example, if you look at the abstract for an article and it's not structured according to the way that your guidance expects it to be structured, then you should have the ability to reject that article there and then, and even without necessarily entering into correspondence with the author or explaining in detail why it's been rejected. I've found this to be one of the best ways to keep copy flow moving and to keep things out of your inbox and to move things on quickly. It can seem a bit harsh, desk rejection. However, the quicker you reject an article, the better it is for the author. They can then think again and resubmit the article somewhere else. The third point, which I found very important, is to create a one-way system round your submission and acceptance system. In other words, when one person deals with a manuscript and moves it on, it should not come back to the person who's moved it on. So as an editor-in-chief, if you have associate editors or editors working with you and you move the paper onto them, they should be the one that is then dealing with it. Whether or not they're the people who choose the reviewers, you may do that for them. It shouldn't really matter. They should have the ability to process that paper all the way through to either a recommendation of acceptance to you, or they should be able to reject that paper without having to refer to you. So you do need to trust the staff and the editors who are working with you. So I would encourage what I call subsidiarity amongst your editors and associate editors. Subsidiarity simply means that tasks are devolved down to other people. They can take decisions by themselves. Sometimes editors are not very confident about doing this, and you may have to oversee their work for a while. But once editors are confident, then they should be encouraged to make their own decisions, so that all you have to do is to deal with manuscripts at the beginning of the system, and then of course you will do the final acceptance at the end of the system and do a final edit of the manuscript before it goes on for production. So basically, two things which I found very important for the editor-in-chief is the ability to desk reject, and for the editors to be able to make their own decisions. And that helps to create this one-way system. And of course, it only works if you check in regularly, don't become overwhelmed yourself, and you don't overwhelm your editors with manuscripts. Now, this is an example of a one-way system, and it happens to be the one used by Elsevier, the publisher with whom I currently work. It's very similar, in fact, almost identical to the one used by Wiley, with whom I previously worked. There is one difference, however, but I'll come to that in a minute. But essentially, it provides a one-way system with very few return loops in it, and it takes the manuscript from submission through the review process and editors up to the decision to accept, and then on to production. Now, in the Elsevier system, the manuscript is submitted and first checked by an administrative agent, and they check it for very superficial things like length, layout, referencing system, and some technical aspects such as similarity. If they're not happy with that, they can send it back to the author until these things are corrected. My view, and I've spoken to my publisher about this, is that this wastes a great deal of time. When I worked with my previous publisher, Wiley, the editor-in-chief was the first person to see the manuscript, and I could then decide on the basis of whether it was suitable or not and fitted the journal, whether to put it forward to an administrative agent. So that cut down their work and cut down the number of manuscripts coming in to the editors. So there are different ways of doing this initial step, but nevertheless, someone needs to do an initial check and to make sure that the paper is suitable technically, and then the paper then comes to the editor-in-chief for a decision about whether it's suitable to go forward to an editor. Now, you'll notice that there are two editors-in-chief here. There's an editor-in-chief and a deputy editor-in-chief. This happens to be my specific journal, which at the moment has a separate deputy editor-in-chief dealing with midwifery papers, and I deal with the nursing papers, but they go forward equally to the editors. Now, you'll notice that both the editors-in-chief and the assistant editor-in-chief or deputy editor-in-chief can both make a decision to desk reject a paper. I've already referred to this before, but this is a great help in making sure that manuscripts which may not make it through the system don't go into the system. So the editors don't become overwhelmed, and manuscripts don't have to be continually revised and don't take too much work to get up to the appropriate standard. So do try to focus on the manuscripts which you think are suitable for publication and will make it through the review system. Of course, there are no guarantees. The editors-in-chief assign papers to an editor. They invite reviewers. The reviewers are returned. I'll talk about peer review later. And then the editor submits a decision or a recommendation, and they can reject the manuscript at that point. Once it's been assigned to them, it's their manuscript. It doesn't have to come back to either of the editors-in-chief. If they decide that the manuscript is worthy of revision, it will go back through the system and be reassigned to that editor to take it through. And if they decide it's then suitable for acceptance, it moves over to the right-hand side of the page to the green box. The editor recommends acceptance. Then the editor-in-chief alone then makes a final decision, edits the paper finally, and informs the author that the paper has been accepted and moves the paper on to production. Production is not usually anything to do with the editorial staff. That usually is handled by a completely different set of staff. On my journal at the moment, and increasingly on my previous journal, editors-in-chief did not see the proofs for the articles. Only the authors did. That's something you need to decide with your publishers based on the quality and the accuracy of the proofs. But it does help to move things on more quickly if they don't come back to you and only the author checks them and takes final responsibility for them. So that's the system that we use at my present journal. It's more or less the same templates that are used by all journals. It's fairly standard, but I say the important thing about it is it's a one-way system and it allows people to make decisions and not to have to go back to someone else in the chain above them to make that decision. The peer review process is definitely the rate limiting step in the publication process. You can get everything else in your one-way system working perfectly, but inevitably this will be the step at which things are slowed down. And the problems, as I've already indicated, are many-fold. You can have difficulty finding reviewers. Sometimes if you find them, you can have difficulty getting them to respond. And sometimes when they respond, they take a long time to do the review. And if you have a Clarivate journal, or you're hoping to be listed in Clarivate for an impact factor, or to have any kind of reputation, you need at least 2 independent peer reviews for each article. So you can't get around this. I find one of the ways to ensure that you have a good pool of reviewers is to, frankly, invite as many people to be peer reviewers as you possibly can, making sure that they do have the right clinical and or the right academic qualifications, usually at least a PhD or equivalent, or certainly that they have published. And everyone who publishes in your journal should be given the opportunity to be a peer reviewer. That could be automated within your processes, so that when somebody publishes in the journal, they are congratulated on publishing, the paper's accepted, and they are invited to be a peer reviewer. So the more reviewers you have, the better. But the other thing you need to do is, once you do have a good pool of reviewers and you're using them regularly, you do need to monitor to see who the good reviewers are and who the poor reviewers are. The ones who respond at all, the ones who respond quickly, and the ones who respond constructively. And you should have a mechanism for weeding out or getting rid of the ones that don't review very well. Otherwise, they will be used again by your editors and will just give you the same problems in the future. So you need to try and build up your pool of peer reviewers, and also to monitor them so that you focus on the ones that are good. And of course, one of the ways to maintain a good pool of reviewers is to give them good papers to review, which are well within their capabilities methodologically and clinically, and not to overwhelm them. So don't send every paper out for peer review. Have that system that I've already mentioned, whereby you can desk reject, and indeed, even if the editors don't like the papers that you send to them, they should probably be able to reject them at that stage as well, so that the peer reviewers don't become overwhelmed. People who are peer reviewers for journal get an awful lot of work to do these days. So you've got to make sure that they don't have too much to do, and that they are loyal to your journal. So all journals have the same problems. There isn't a single journal that doesn't. If you ever see a journal, this is more advice for an author rather than an editor, but if you ever see a journal saying they have a rapid peer review system, then they are telling lies. It's simply impossible. You can't get around the peer reviewing system. It's very difficult to speed it up. And you've got to be very careful about responding to pressure from authors who say, I need this paper published for my PhD, or I need it for my promotion. You cannot give in to that kind of pressure. The only advice you can give these people is that they should have submitted their paper sooner. So again, reiterating what I've said before, try only to put good manuscripts into the system. The poorer the manuscripts you put in, the more your reviewers will become frustrated and ultimately will not wish to review for you. And also in the peer review process, to speed it up, encourage editors to make decisions based on reviews without a second round of review. Try to encourage editors to realise that they don't always have to put something out for review again. If they're familiar with the material or they think that the reviewer points have been addressed by the author, they should be able to make a decision on that paper. And I would strongly discourage editors from sending manuscripts out to different reviewers again. This is very frustrating for authors, and it's also very frustrating for the reviewers. Sometimes I'm asked to review a paper by a journal, and I haven't been the person who has done the first review, and that puts you in a very difficult position, so you should try to discourage that. So again, encouraging editors to be autonomous and to have subsidiarity, so whereby they can make decisions, is very helpful to speeding up the peer review process. The fewer times you can put a paper out for review, the quicker it will get through your system. Next, I want to look at some of the challenges related to quality of articles. Now, it's, as you can imagine, difficult to know where to stop here because there are so many issues related to quality of articles. But there are one or two things that, as editors, we need to be aware of, which we also need to make authors aware of. And these are as follows. We need to be aware, initially, that there are increasing expectations around international standards related to academic publication. Organisations like Clarivate, which award impact factors, expect journals to adhere to these international standards. So, for example, the Equator standards, the Equator network, which is available online, publishes a range of standards concerned with the publication of specific kinds of studies, for example, randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews. So we need to make sure that we are up to date with these. They're constantly being added to and updated, and that we need to make our authors aware of these. Study registration is now compulsory for randomized controlled trials for most journals and most publishers. All the major publishers adhere to this. It's called the All Trials Agreement. In other words, randomized controlled trials involving humans should be registered with an appropriate registration site, certainly in advance of publication and, strictly speaking, in advance of commencing the study. But strictly speaking, all studies involving human participants should be registered. If they're not a randomized controlled trial, you can't register them with a trial site, but you can register them on open science sites, for example. And we also need to be aware of publication ethics, and these are largely governed, as it were, or the codes of practice are largely published by an organisation called COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. And again, all the major publishers subscribe to COPE. Not every publisher does, but all the major ones do. Even if they don't, I think we should still adhere to COPE standards, Committee on Publication Ethics standards, which tell us how to detect and manage issues such as plagiarism and fabrication of data. So, to ensure quality, there are several things we can do. We, as editors, need to keep up to date with the latest developments. We need to make sure that we know what they are in order to make sure that our guidance is up to date, and therefore that our authors are clear what the latest developments in academic publishing quality are. We need to promote these international standards and to provide specific links in our author guidance, for example, to the Equator guidance. We need to develop a submission checklist. This might be something that we use, or if we are lucky enough to have a journal desk that they can use, which very clearly lays out what needs to be in an article. For example, if it's a randomized controlled trial, is it registered and does it adhere to consort standards which come under COPE? This is something that doesn't require an editor necessarily to check, but there should be a checklist so that very quickly we can see if an article meets the appropriate standards for that kind of article. So we need to keep up to date. Check if your publisher has a blog or a newsletter. I know, for example, that Wiley are very good at this, as are Elsevier at providing information for editors. But usually these are online and open access, and anyone can access them. Join the International Academy of Nursing Editors, and this will put you onto a mailing list. They've got an excellent website, and they have an excellent publication called Nurse, Author and Editor, which I think you ought to be aware of. It's also free to access, and they hold annual conferences and cover many important aspects of academic publishing, particularly in relation to nursing. Register for the COPE newsletter. So go to the COPE website and make sure that you get their monthly newsletters. And in these newsletters, you will get updates of guidance. You will also see cases that are being investigated. It's very, very helpful and also very, very interesting. And for example, there are other websites. I think the Scholarly Kitchen is a good website and a good email list to get onto. Not everything is absolutely relevant to academic publishing, but now and again they have articles which are relevant. And the Scholarly Kitchen website is a good resource as well. They send out bulletins every day, 5 days a week. So these are some examples of what you can do to keep up to date. You need to ensure that you are promoting international standards in your journal. So you should list these in your guidance and insist on adherence to what I've already mentioned, the Equator Guidelines. Articles should not be accepted for publication without, or even go into your reviewing system until they do meet the Equator Guidelines. They have the appropriate tables and diagrams in the article, and also the appropriate checklist is submitted along with the article. You should insist on registration of randomized controlled trials, and again, strictly speaking, you should insist on registration according to the World Health Organization guidelines of all studies that involve human participants. I think that we should be moving towards open science, which I will talk about later. This involves open access, open reviewing, availability of data, pre-printing of articles. Again, most major publishers are signed up to open science, and some individual journals are not necessarily. It's coming. It's an international movement. I approve of it. I think it's been very helpful. And I think you need to be aware of the requirements of open science and encourage open science in your journal. We should also insist, of course, on adherence to COPE standards, the ethical publication standards. As I say, not every publisher will be a subscriber to COPE, and if your publisher happens not to be, I still think it's a good idea to insist on using COPE standards for publication, and also that you will use these to investigate any ethical problems that arise. And ensure that your submission guidance is up to date. There should be an annual review along with your fellow editors, possibly your board, and with your publisher of your submission guidance. So that should be done at least annually. But I do this annually, and I also know that I often have to update it 4 or 5 times within the year as things change. publication standards change, you notice that some things may be missing, authors bring to your attention anomalies within the guidance, say this doesn't match that part of the guidance, you need to make sure that these are all sorted as and when they arise. You shouldn't leave your submission guidance to get out of date, but at the very least you need an annual review, and it's never ever in my experience the case that submission guidance doesn't need to be updated. It always needs to be updated. Develop a submission checklist. I think the journal desk or the administrator should have a single page of A4, not too many details, not too big, outlining the basic requirements of a manuscript. Nothing to do with the intellectual content or the research methods, but simply its structure and content in terms of the aspects of the guidance that it should contain. So they should be able to check the abstract format. Does it conform to that? If it doesn't, it needs to go back to the author. The length of the manuscript, that's very easy to check, but you need to specify whether that includes or excludes the references and tables. The structure of the manuscript, is it organized in the correct way? Has it got the correct headings and subheadings in the article? Does it run from introduction through methods to results and discussion? And what are the permitted headings and subheadings? Does it meet the appropriate equator standard? For example, if it's an RCT, is it adherent to consort? If it's a systematic review, does it meet PRISMA requirements? Is the referencing system correct? And finally, is there study registration for all studies involving human participants? So these things are very simple to check off very quickly before the article goes forward for review. The next topic I want to cover is promoting your journal, and I'm going to look at this under 3 headings. First of all, using social media, then providing writing for publication workshops, and finally writing about academic publishing. I find that these are all good ways to promote your journal, draw attention to the content of your journal and to you, and to lend credibility to some of the debates around academic publishing, and also to contribute towards them. So first of all, I'll look at social media. By social media, I'm going to talk exclusively about Twitter. There are other platforms available, such as Facebook and Instagram and many other platforms. I would warn you about using Facebook. It requires a lot of maintenance, and we've used one for a previous journal I worked with, but eventually closed it down. I've also used Instagram to promote content, but the problem with Instagram is that you cannot put up live links. As I say, there are other ways of promoting the content, for example, on a blog, but again, blogs require a lot of maintenance. Twitter is very easy to use, and while it's perhaps not as popular as it used to be, especially amongst younger people, its use still grows, and it is very widely used by academics. I think there might be some evidence to show that academics are amongst the most frequent users of Twitter. So Twitter is a very effective way to promote the content of journals, and most leading journals have got Twitter pages and good Twitter followings. If you're going to set up a Twitter account, learn to use it effectively. And frankly, I think as the editor-in-chief, unless you appoint another editor to do it, I think you really need to take responsibility for the Twitter account. I wouldn't get too involved in reading what other people put up or connecting with other people who put up messages and so forth. I would simply use it to put out your content and to use it perhaps on a daily basis. 1 tweet a day probably is quite enough. So it doesn't have to be onerous. And the problem is if you devolve that to someone else, they may not do it properly and you still have to keep an eye on it. So I've just always found myself that it's easier to do it myself. You're most unlikely to have anyone in your publishing company who will do it for you as well. So it does require some time and some effort. But a Twitter account is very easy to set up. So learn to use it effectively, use it regularly. I think you should put up something at least every working day. Sometimes it'll be the contents of your journal, but sometimes it will be tweets to other interesting things about publication, for example, ethics, or about open access, or anything that's current. Try to use it informatively, and I'll point out the best ways to do this. So the effective use of Twitter: learn about the value of retweeting. Not necessarily retweeting things yourself, but learn how valuable it is when people retweet your content. Make sure that you use links. If you put up something about a recent article, for example, that's been published in your journal, you must put up a link to it. Of course, the article may not necessarily be open access, but at least they'll be able to read the abstract. Learn about using hashtags. They can be very useful. Hashtags are there to gather content together and to allow people to discuss particular topics. And it's a really good idea to include pictures. Most good journal sites, if you tweet out content with a link, will put up a picture at least of the journal cover, but I think it's sometimes more interesting to find your own pictures on Google Image and to attach them. I'll show you an example in just a minute. So here's an example of the power of a retweet. This has nothing to do with academic nursing or academic publishing, but there's one tweet by a magazine called Digital Woman. It gets retweeted essentially at 3 levels. It's retweeted by someone who picks it up on the journal. 3 other people retweet that, and one of those retweets that. And depending on the number of followers, it can potentially reach a great many people. The potential number of people who could have read this tweet is nearly 20,000. Of course, not all of them will read it, but imagine if, say, 10% of them read it. That's quite a large number. That's at least a couple of thousand people. And if even only 10% of them actually follow the link and go to read the article or download it, then at least you've got a few hundred people accessing the content. So when people retweet your tweets, it can be very effective, and I know that it does happen a great deal. And the more interesting and the more informative and the more attractive you make them, the more likely your tweets are to be retweeted. So here's an example of a tweet I put up recently about an article published in my journal. I've got the title of the article, I've got hashtags, a link, and a picture. So I've got the information about the article, I've got the title of the article, I've got the direct link to the article, so when someone clicks on that, they will be taken to the landing page for the article. I've included some relevant hashtags, for example, feedback, nursing, education. It's not always essential to put hashtags in, but they can be very useful. And I have provided an interesting picture about giving constructive criticism. So that takes you about, I would reckon, about 60 seconds to do a tweet like that. That's not too much time each day, I don't think. I do a lot of writing for publication workshops for potential authors, and this is a very useful way of promoting your journal and promoting the content. These can be done at conferences. Conferences are always happy to have people doing writing for publication workshops. So do look for opportunities and take up invitations. I also make great use of YouTube, so anything that I do, I will make a separate PowerPoint, a little bit like the one you're watching at the moment, and I will put that up on YouTube. And they are greatly watched and commented on, so I know that people find that very useful. There are other social media platforms for videos, but YouTube is the most common one. And also there are companies who are willing to promote your content. Sometimes they will even pay you or the journal to do it if you're willing to do sort of workshops for them, and they will put it out under a commercial basis. And Inago, for example, is one company that I work with, and they're always looking for editors in particular to do work related to their journal or work that will help other people to write and publish. They address a very international audience, and again, while it may not be done under the auspices of your journal or your publisher, at least you will be introduced as the editor-in-chief or editor of your journal. So the journal does get promoted this way. And I think we should also be willing to write about academic publishing. There's an outlet called Nurse, Author and Editor, which is published now by Wiley and is run by the INANE network, the International Academy of Nursing Editors, edited by Leslie Nichol. I'm a regular contributor to this. It's very good because it's free, and it's mostly editors who contribute, and they write about issues which authors are known to find difficult. So they write about ethical issues, about open access, but even about very straightforward things such as how to write an introduction to a paper, how to write a discussion, and how best to write an abstract. Those are just some examples. There are also examples and articles in Nurse, Author and Editor about promoting the content of your journal. So there are articles there about using Twitter, about blogging, and other ways of promoting your content online through social media. So it's managed by INANE and published by Wiley. You can also contribute to textbooks about writing. Most publishers will publish textbooks about writing, usually edited or completely written by leading editors. And I've certainly worked with a colleague from Elsevier when I was at Wiley, so these things can go across publishers to produce a multi-authored book on writing and publication for nursing and healthcare. These can be kept up to date, and they are very popular. And of course, the objective of doing these things is not only to help people to write, but to promote yourself, to promote your journal, and to promote its content. So just out of interest, this is the landing page for Nurse, Author and Editor. The articles are free to read. They're open access, so you don't have to have a paywall or to go to this through your library. You can access it directly, and the content is all available there. And as editors, you may well come up with issues that you may want to write about, and you can contact the editor or submit an article directly. Next, and I think finally in the presentation, I want to talk about open science and some issues around open science. Open science includes such things as open access, open science itself, which under the larger umbrella of open science refers to some specific things like sharing data and publishing preprints, and it includes, of course, open access, preprinting, which I've mentioned. And I think that editors now need to be positive about open science, open access, preprinting, and so forth. There's a great deal of pressure in Europe to move towards open science, and it covers all of these. It also includes things like open reviewing, whereby authors and reviewers are known to each other and reviews are published. So it's a very wide concept. It's aimed to produce greater accountability, greater transparency, and to make articles and data and the processes more available to the general readership. So open access is almost a universal requirement of universities and funding bodies, certainly in my part of the world, but increasingly across the world. You need in your guidance to clarify the open access conditions. This will be provided by the publisher. This is not in the gift of the editor. In fact, you have to be very careful as an editor not to be involved in the open access process. Open access, particularly gold open access, where people pay for open access, brings a great deal of money into publishers, so the editor must be detached completely from that process. But you do need to clarify what the restrictions are for open access within your author guidance. These are the basic open access models on the right. On the left, that's supposed to be a brick wall or a pay wall. That's the more traditional subscription-based model, whereby libraries and some individuals, and certainly hospitals, but very, very few individuals, usually institutions, pay for the journal. And if you're a member of that institution or that organization, then you can access it without having to pay. Open access is different. This allows people to access your content free. There are three models. Starting at the top, there's a platinum open access model, whereby the author doesn't have to pay to make it open access and people can access it for free. There aren't many examples of this. Some society journals allow this. For example, the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh, that's a platinum open access journal because you don't have to pay to publish in it and it's completely open access. Some other organisations do that and make them available to the general public, but not all. So platinum open access is quite rare. The most common form of open access is the gold open access. This also gives immediate open access to a reader, but the person publishing the article has to pay, or more usually his or her institution has to pay. And of course, because the publishers are losing money from the subscription-based model, gold open access can be very expensive. It can cost thousands of dollars to do this. And finally, at the bottom, there's green open access, and this is again very much encouraged in Europe and compulsory for funding bodies, for charities and for universities. And what happens is that a version, the final accepted version of the manuscript, is made available on a repository, usually run by a university, online, but it's only available for reading after a particular period, an embargo period, which can be between 6 months and 2 years. So it does not necessarily offer immediate open access to the reader. It doesn't cost anything to the author, but of course it does cost institutions money to run these databases. So open access, you shouldn't resist it. It's very much the model now, and it's very much encouraged. And whatever you think of it personally, and whatever your publisher thinks of it, I think it's something that we have to adopt and adapt to. Open science, I say, increasingly an international requirement. You should enable links in your journal, or your publisher should, for archiving supplementary material, for example, data or material that tables and figures that you're unable to present within the manuscript, or permit links to other repositories. So again, it's something that we should be enabling. I'm sure that most publishers are aware of these things, but sometimes it's up to editors to drive it and to make sure that these things are, if they're trends within their own field, and there's certainly a trend within nursing and medical research and all health research now, we need to make sure that our publishers are helping us to conform to open science. And it's probably worth considering making open science, in other words, open access and all the things above, and indeed pre-printing, consider making it a requirement for submission to your journal. It's not compulsory for most journals yet, so perhaps I wouldn't say that you need to do this, but I think it's worth considering. And I think in future, open science will be absolutely the norm, and it will become compulsory. So I think the sooner that we as editors adopt this and get on with it, the better. And encourage study registration. This is compulsory for randomized controlled trials. They cannot be published by any reputable publishing company without registration. But I would also strongly encourage you to consider registration of all studies involving human participants. If they're not a randomized controlled trial, they can't be registered at a trial site, but there are other places, open science sites, where these can be registered. So the Open Science Framework is one example, and here it is free to submit your research protocols and your data and put up links to papers that are not clinical trials. And there's also the Centre for Open Science, very similar. But as far as I know, the Centre for Open Science requires a subscription. I've used the other framework. I haven't actually used this one, but they are, I know, very similar. Both, I think, run from the United States. And also we should be quite relaxed, I think, about pre-printing. Allow it in your journals. In other words, allow people to pre-print their manuscripts before they submit them to your journal, before they go out for review. There are sites like medRxiv, which I show the logo for here, which has a separate section for nursing papers. And these are officially published here with a DOI. And as I say, most publishers allow this, and under open science, it's strongly encouraged. And once the paper is accepted and published, the pre-printing site will put up a link to that published paper. So people will know that a preprint is a preprint, that it's not been reviewed, and it may have changes made to it, but they will also have access, once the paper is published, to the published, reviewed, and edited version. Be aware of it at the submission stage when you're checking for similarity, because of course if something is put on a repository online, it will show up as being similar to your submission system, to the manuscript on your submission system. So you need to be aware of this, and of course if it is a preprint, then it should be okay, as long as they haven't plagiarized or copied from other sources. But that would, if you're using a good similarity checking tool, you would be able to see that. And ensure that you've got information related to pre-printing, which would come under your open science guidelines within your author guidance. I refer back regularly to author guidance. Everything should be in there that you could potentially want authors to consider. So pre-printing looks a little bit like this. A preprint is a work in progress, but submitted to a journal by in progress. We mean it's not been reviewed. Green green open access, that's a publication of the accepted copy, and that's very much encouraged these days as well under an embargo. And finally, the gold version, which is the fully published version, which can either be open access or can be paid for through a subscription, but it's the final published version, and they all relate to each other, and it's clear at each stage which is which. My advice about academic editing, and I think that's generally what this is about, is don't panic at any stage in the process of being an academic editor. There are no emergencies in this. There's nothing that can't be fixed or undone, certainly before publication. Don't get into the habit of responding to other people's emergencies when they say, I have to have this paper for my thesis or for my promotion. That is not your concern. So as I say, as I'm being rather facetious, but please don't panic about academic publishing. And if something goes wrong after an article is published, again, there are ways of dealing with that. So it's not worth losing sleep about academic publishing. So finally, this is the final slide. If you want to contact me about anything, about the content of this lecture or generally about academic publishing with which you think I might be able to help, that's my current editing email, nepeditor@outlook.com. If you want to find out more about me personally and my research record, you can go to my ORCID record or you can scan that QR. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me personally, although my journal also has a Twitter site. And finally, if you happen to use WeChat, which is used a great deal in the Far East, then you can also connect with me on WeChat. So I hope that you found that session useful. I look forward to any questions or comments. And once again, and finally, obrigado. Thank you very much. Goodbye.